front line of policing is loud, but the voices behind it, they're a lot louder and I think, frankly, a lot more interesting. Hi, I'm Bob Plaschke, and this is First Response. This is the number one podcast that takes you behind the badge and uncovers real stories and experiences of first responders from all walks of life and the topics that shape public safety today. If you're curious about the guy or the gal behind the hero, and they are indeed truly heroes, and the topics that they care about, take a listen. This is kind of your front row seat to hearing some of the really interesting voices out there, and more importantly, the heroes. This podcast is sponsored by Pepperball, where I have the honor to serve as CEO. Pepperball creates non-lethal alternatives to guns police use to keep themselves and the public safe. So today, I'm really excited. Well, I'm joined by Chief Olson. Chief Olson is the police chief and has been the police chief of Appleton, Wisconsin, around 75,000 folks living there. She manages or oversees the department of around 100 police officers. This is very much the kind of typical police agency in the United States, or one that you would kind of consider a medium-sized agency that makes up a lot of and covers a lot of what is across the United States. Chief Olson is a bit unique, particularly in Wisconsin. Only 3% of the police chiefs in Wisconsin, I think, if I get the statistic right, are female. It's roughly 8 to 10% of police chiefs across the United States are females. That trend is moving in the hopefully the right direction, so it's increasing, but it is a very small minority of the executive leadership in policing today. She has done an amazing job of building her agency, and is one of those really nice stories of someone who was born and raised in Appleton, and has then grown up to actually become the police chief of Appleton. And that is increasingly more rare, unfortunately. A lot of movement of police chiefs across agencies. And so it's great to see someone that's been brought up kind of from the cradle to this position, so to speak. So Chief Olson, so great to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining. My first question is, how does that happen? How do you, to be born and raised, did you always want to be a police officer when you were young, or is this an unexpected career path for you?
Hi, yeah, thank you for having me on the show today. Great question. For me, this was not something that was on the radar at all when I was in high school or approaching college. It's one of the reasons why I feel so passionately now about getting into high schools and getting into schools and having contact with girls earlier so that they can be introduced into a career of public safety. So back in the 90s when I was in high school, late 80s, early 90s, high school and college, law enforcement for women was not really something that we were ever pushed into or really, considered as a career path. So I actually wanted to be a nurse, like to the traditional, a lot of women did back then, and ended up going to college for initially nursing. And then I actually changed and ultimately graduated with a degree in biology. And while I was in school, I gave some consideration to attending medical school. And so I ended up getting a job at a hospital where I worked in the lab. And then that exposed me to the work that pathologists do. So interestingly enough, back in college, I worked as what's called a diener or a morgue assistant, and I would assist with autopsies at the hospital. And it was very, very interesting. I look back on that part of my life and I learned so much about a lot of things through that experience. And then that actually opened up a door for me to work as a deputy coroner for the county that I live in, Outagamie County, which is one of 3 counties that Appleton is in. And while I was working as a deputy coroner, I started my family, got married, had a couple of kids, and was working very closely at that time with law enforcement, and to include many detectives from Appleton PD. And it was, during one of those death investigations that we were working side by side that a detective had said to me, like, hey, you should come work for us. And I was quite honestly at first just kind of like, that's just crazy. Like I watched Cops, of course, like everybody did back in the day, and
Right.
it just enjoyed the show, but never considered myself actually in that role. And he's like, yeah, we can set up a ride along for you. So I was like, okay, and so I did. I went on a ride along, and that led to 2 more ride alongs, and ultimately decided that, I could really see myself doing this work. And so I applied and went through the process, and Appleton at that time was a very progressive agency in that they were one of few that would sponsor people or sponsor, recruits, and then pay for them not only to attend Recruit Academy, but also pay them a salary while they were attending Recruit Academy. So for me, being selected out of a pool at that time, they were getting 300 to 400 applicants for 1 or 2 positions. And then to be actually paid a salary while attending school, it was really the best case scenario with somebody with a young family. So that's how I got started.
Yeah, I'm interested. Friends always ask me, they said, what is the typical motivation for someone to join the police force? And how do you know that it's actually right? That you are, you're cut out for that, because it is an incredibly challenging career, and the amount of stress and danger and risk. So you're a young mother with 2 small children at home.
Mm-hmm.
When you did these ride-alongs, what about it jumped out at you that said that it was the right thing for you to consider?
Yeah, so I think in general, for me, I never saw myself as being somebody that would ever be happy sitting in an office, or just having kind of the job that has some level of monotony to it. I've always enjoyed just the challenge of having to use my brain, think through different situations and solutions on my toes, and to be challenged like that all the time. And so for me, though, that policing offered that experience. And of course, when at the time I was in my mid-20s and still had that philosophy where, I never considered the risk involved, honestly, or the danger involved. Obviously, the older me now looks at that much differently than the younger me did. But at the time, I was more driven by the challenge of tackling new situations every day, the adrenaline rush that you get from that.
Right.
And also, I believe in the calling of law enforcement as well. So I really felt that calling when I was sitting in that squad car, and I just really could picture myself, in the seat where the police officer was at the time, and really felt like I could do the work and that I could serve my community in that way. So I think those were the main things that kind of drove me to. Because then, of course, I had to make sure I'd get myself in shape. I was at that time when I was doing the ride-alongs, I was only a few months postpartum with my second child. So, I got on the track and started running, and, push-ups and all the rest of the things that one has to do to get in shape for a fitness test, and got it done.
Yeah, and that's what I typically do hear from folks, which was, there was this element of a community service, and you being born and raised in Appleton, what a wonderful way to give back. I have, as you said, I've also heard this notion of the dynamic, very it's almost like for attention deficit disorder folks. It's the constant changing environment, and it's the furthest thing from a desk job that you could think of. And I'm increasingly, because I'm just interested in the psychology of this. I'm increasingly focused on this last element, which is you were just too young to really think through. Or you're kind of still in that invincible mode. Not you, but just generally, kids in that age. And I have young adults who they that's not even a consideration. That element of risk. Now, when you went home to your husband, what did he have to say? Does he come from a law enforcement background, or was that something that was unusual for him when you told him of your aspiration?
Well, so the first thing he said when I told him I was going to apply was, I don't know if I can quote him exactly, but it was something along the lines of "over my dead body." It was, so, again, the younger me was much more like, anytime somebody challenged me or maybe said I couldn't do something, that just drove me more to want to do it. But, interestingly, after the initial shock of it, because of course, his mind immediately went to the safety piece where my mind didn't.
Right.
And the risk involved, once he realized that I really did have my mind set on it, he couldn't have been more supportive and continues to be, after we've been married 31 years now, like my biggest supporter. So yeah, his initial response was not the most positive, to be honest. But thankfully he came around and like I said, couldn't have been more supportive of me. And I couldn't have been able to be in this career for going on 26 years without having, that kind of support from him. So,
it's one of the things we talk about on this podcast is the significant, horrific mental challenge, the mental aspect of this, the amount of incidents that you have to observe and experience, that's well beyond what a normal civilian would ever have to go through, the traumatic incidents, so to speak. And the thing we don't talk a lot about is what the spouses have to go through, because in effect, you're in it. And to some degree, you feel like you have a bit of control, where you have the spouses who just have to wait at home every night, and just make sure that they're, just happy that you walk through the door. That must have been very, I guess, interesting for him to have to get used to that.
Yeah, I think he had it twofold, right? So it was challenging, I think, for him because he was one of very few husbands whose wives did this kind of work. So, whereas the wives, at least I can speak to our department, like we work really hard to connect our wives, our spouses together so that they have their own support system within themselves, right? And I think, he's always been on the outside of that, being a male. And I think you had asked me earlier if he came from a background of law enforcement, and no, his background and what he does for work is all in sales. So he's really never had any background in law enforcement at all. And so I think it was hard for him, and even more hard because he didn't necessarily have the connections to people to be able to, have somebody maybe that's not me to talk to about what he was experiencing as a spouse. So I think, it's difficult for spouses for sure. But the advantage that a lot of wives have is that they connect with other wives whose husbands work together on shift, and then they can build their own connections. Whereas I think it's more difficult for the husbands because they don't necessarily have that same ability.
No, that was, I guess, intuitively, I was thinking through that in the sense of it there isn't the built-in community group for him in that sense, and so he had to maybe rough it out more on his own. When you joined, how many women were in the agency at the time? And by the way, let me ask, how many women are in the agency now?
I would say, I wish I could say that we've increased our percentage of women here, but we really haven't. So we're at about 12 women out of 116 sworn right now. So we have less than 10% of our agency is comprised of women. We don't get a lot of women applicants here. And so it's something that, again, we continue to work on by starting earlier and trying to get more women interested in public safety. But a lot of the bigger cities, like to the south of us, when I speak of Madison and Milwaukee, have a much higher percentage of women working for them than what we do. It seems on the northern half of the state of Wisconsin, just not as many applicants coming our way. So it's about the same as it was 25 years ago.
Well, and as the nature of policing is changing and continues to change, I think the role for a woman versus a man, and again, it really is gender neutral to some degree, but I think it's a much more a focus on de-escalation, a much more focus on community engagement, a much more wider scope of responsibilities than the notion of the traditional beat cop on the corner, so to speak, or in a patrol car is not nearly as relevant, and the physical requirements, I would imagine 30, 40, 50 years ago, there was a lot more hands-on work where people had to take people down. And now with de-escalation techniques and engaging at distance with other tools, that's not as much of a predominant requirement. So to some degree, the hope would be that you would see more women involved in this, because it is so important in terms of, since half the population that they're engaging are women, if not more.
Yeah. So many things you said are so true. So, the evolution, like early in my career, I was probably 4 or 5 years on when we had the introduction of the taser. So the first taser device. And so from there, to your point, there's been this evolution of this introduction of tools that have made our job easier, in the sense that we have options to disengage or to engage in different ways, which didn't necessarily involve like what I just called a traditional pig pile, which is what we had to do early on in my career. Anytime we wanted to take somebody into custody that didn't necessarily want to be cooperative with us. And so you would think that would then make it more attractive for women. And I think on some level, there's a lot of truth to that. Some of the skill sets that women bring to this line of work, excuse me, are our strong communication skills, our empathy, our compassion. We have a different kind of ability to communicate with people in crisis that, again, just an added value when you take us and men side by side working together. We can resolve situations, I think, more effectively than when you're looking at just men or just women. And the downside, though, to this career still that we haven't been able to find a way to overcome is, women are the traditional homemakers, right? They obviously don't have any option but to be the carrier of the child if they decide to have a family. And it's difficult when you are working as a patrol officer for an agency and now you have to be taken off the road for what's probably going to be 9 or 10 months total from the time of, your pregnancy has progressed to the point where you can't get your duty belt on anymore. And it's probably not safe for you to continue in that role, to now you've got either 3 months, 4 months, 5 months postpartum. You're at home caring for the child. Now you have to return to work. And then many times when you're returning to work, it's shift work, right? You're not working your traditional 9 to 5 job, but many times you're working overnights. You're trying to nurse or pump milk. Like, those are the things that continue to be a hardship for many women that cause them to rethink whether or not policing is really a career for them. And sometimes when they're forced into a decision where who has to quit, right? It seems to be like the women are the ones that are kind of forced to have to either find a different career path or stay home to care for for a young family when they're faced with that situation. So I think that that's what's preventing, I think, what you're talking about, getting those numbers to really grow.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. You were, I guess, in some ways, and therefore the city of Appleton was lucky that you had already had your children to some degree, so that you had gotten past some of that. But to your point, getting women to come in their 20s, which is the time that they would naturally enter, then they have to deal with the family issues that most hopefully would have to encounter. I'm jumping around, but just before I forget, when you said you joined, there was 300 applicants for a small number of spots. How is that today? How many applicants do you have? I assume the numbers have changed.
Yeah, the numbers have changed significantly. So generally, when we keep a process open for, I would say, a month or two, we probably get anywhere between 40 and 60 applicants. Yeah, it's very different.
And that's, it's one of the things which is frustrating. It's kind of half the reason I do the podcast is, the policing has never been easy. It's getting much more difficult. The scope of the work that the scope of the issues you have to deal with, particularly mental illness, has expanded aggressively as other social networks and social safety nets have disappeared. And the public's perception of police has been negatively affected over the last couple of decades. George Floyd as incidents as a painful example, and as such, recruiting goes down, which means overtime goes up, which means more stress on your existing officers and them retiring early. It's a really vicious cycle of which it's very difficult to break. Am I on track here? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I definitely think you're on track. Politics have absolutely impacted our ability to recruit and retain people, for sure. I really try to, tell my staff and my agency when we talk through some of those presenting issues or we're interviewing, prospective candidates. Like I speak to what, I try to block out the noise of what's happening across the country and encourage them to do the same and focus in on this community and what the city of Appleton, the Fox Valley, how they feel about law enforcement. And I'm at least pleased to be able to share that in general, like we've got a very positive relationship with our community here, one that we invest a lot of time and energy into cultivating and maintaining. But that doesn't necessarily, we still are impacted. This nationwide trend of people moving away from either thinking of law enforcement in a positive way or even just generally respecting, police officers or respecting the rules, laws, things like that traditionally, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it's like, our word or what we said carried weight. Whereas now, we're questioned. If we don't have a body camera on, it's like, well, they question our integrity on a very regular basis. And so it's a completely different time to police in. And I give a lot of credit to people that are still interested in going into this line of work and that are considering policing as a career. And because it's very different than it was when I went into it 25 years ago.
It is. And it's again, part of the reason that I'm trying to do these podcasts, the education and the awareness. I was talking to someone last night out of the FOP, which is the Fraternal Order of Police. It's a police union, and they were talking about the most dangerous. The most dangerous times for police officers, or one of the most dangerous times for police officers, are when they have to, where they're most likely to get injured, is when they have to pull someone over and engage someone out of their automobile. And if you think about that, that is the time that they're most likely to get injured, hurt, or killed. And how little empathy we have when we're pulled over for that, because you're like, oh, hey, why'd you do that? Or and if they and then you're expecting them to be polite and nice and cheerful. It's just inconsistent with the fact base.
Yeah. Yep.
The back to again, and I'm focusing on this because it's the minority of people I have on the show are women. So I'm gonna kind of continue to unpack that topic. Being when I've interviewed other women on the show, what they've talked about is, look, being a woman versus a man, I can, as long as you're physically able to do the job, frankly, the female male thing kind of goes away on a day-to-day basis because you're partners, right? And you got each other's back. You're part of a team. You do the job and you stay and you're recognized, or you can't do the job, and independent of whether you're a female or a male, it doesn't really matter. And that actually makes sense to me in terms of the day-to-day policing and being a woman on a patrol or in a police unit. As you moved up the leadership ranks and you started to have to lead and direct and give feedback, did that present challenges being female versus male?
Yeah, I would say it definitely did. For me, I can attribute some of my success to having strong, positive mentors, and the mentors I had were all men. So we didn't have women in this organization that were in leadership roles prior to me moving up. So there were 2 women captains in the history of the PD prior to me being promoted up to captain. I was the 3rd, and then I was the first female assistant chief here, and then the first female chief here. So I really relied on having strong male mentors in my life. Previous, leaders here through this organization predominantly. And I think, interestingly, they saw something in me and some qualities in me that I don't even think I saw in myself. And by providing space for me, inviting me into, say, meetings or to collaborate on certain things, and allowing me to showcase some of the talents I had, for me, just built my confidence and gave me, I think in some ways the permission to feel like I could apply for some of these promotions and find success in them. And I didn't succeed the first time, which I think, something I like to tell a lot of people here that, that are facing challenges or are fearful about applying for a position, that it's okay to fail. That's part of the learning experience and the growth experience. And so not everything came easy and came the first time that I applied, but I focused on the work and being the best possible version of myself that I could be, and really just showcased my tenacity and hard work ethic. And that's just kind of led for one thing to the next, and allowed me to be in the space that I'm in right now.
And that's one of the reasons I do so enjoy working in this industry, or at least supporting police officers and police agencies, and is that it's very much like a sports analogy. The performance is performance. There are politics to some degree, but you're either a good police officer or you're not, and either you lead well and you or you don't, and it's very much it's very visible, so to speak. It doesn't feel like it's a place that people can hide. In that sense.
Yeah, no, you're very right. I would describe myself as more like a reluctant leader, in the sense that, I've kind of filled those gaps and filled those voids where they've needed to be filled, and stepped up and when I've needed to step up. And I think at the time I applied for the chief's position here, it was just, I was what this agency needed, and I knew that. And so even though it was not something I ever set out to do, I actually really miss the patrol work and the contact I would be having regularly with victims of crime, or I worked for a long time as a school resource officer, which I loved. I don't get to do really much policing anymore. I mean, everything I do is either political in nature and dealing with, our city council or the mayor, or, like those large strategic things, and not really the minutia of doing a traffic stop and just having that public contact. And I miss that part a lot. But again, service can look different in different ways. And for me at the time, I promoted 13 years ago. And it was just at a time where that's what I felt like how I best could serve the agency and serve the city is through a leadership position. And that's, when I encourage others, those are the discussions we have. Like, you're going to miss parts of the job. The higher you move up, the less policing you do in this kind of work. But at the same time, it's still about service. It's just, it looks different. Now I do what I can to nurture our employees here and provide them with the resources that they need to meet their goals and that they've set for themselves. And to me, I find a lot of satisfaction and pleasure in just doing that.
Now, I have to ask, as the school resource officer, did your kids go to the same school that you were the SRO?
Yeah, just for a short period of time. I worked, when they were in elementary school, and then I moved into the at-risk high school. And so then, we didn't have the day-to-day contact anymore. But I could tell you a lot of stories about my poor kids and the experiences they had having a mom work in the schools as an officer. So.
Well, I was with one of the women that works at our company. Her father is a retired police chief. He was the police chief of the town that she grew up in, and there were stories about their interactions with boyfriends, and how that must have felt. And how did your children respond? I mean, it must have been kind of cool to have the mom as the police chief, but I would imagine there was other. I'd love you to share a story if you could. I find it fascinating.
Well, the one that comes to mind is I would drive them to school and drop them off at school in my squad car on my way to work some days. And I vividly remember at the time my son was in high school, my daughter would have been in middle school, and had both of them in the car, and somebody, as I was near the high school, one of the kids had like a really, really egregious traffic like a safety thing.
Right.
And so I'm like, I have to do a traffic stop. And both of my kids were like heads down in the squad car. They didn't want anybody to see them. They were absolutely mortified that mom had to do a traffic stop on another classmate. So, it depends on the stage they're at. Like elementary school, they think it's the best thing ever because they're just so proud of the work. And then they get into that weird, awkward stage where they're proud, but then they have to act embarrassed because they don't necessarily always like the attention it brings them. Then by the time I promoted to chief, they were well out of high school. And so my son actually went into policing and was a police officer for 3 years before deciding on a career change. But I think if you were to ask them, I think they would look at that experience as very positive for both of them.
Oh, I'm sure. But at least a couple of fun stories to look back on. I like the one of you having to pull over someone while they're in the back seat. Well, I could. This has been fascinating, Chief, and you've been very generous with your time. But we should let you get back to your day-to-day job. I'll have just one last question for you, and that is, we'd like to make a small honorarium in your name. And what is there a charity that we could make a donation on your behalf?
Yeah, I would love that. So one of the charities that helps fund our canine program here is called Canines for a Safer Community. And so that would be a great charity to donate to that, again, helps us fund our canine program for the city of Appleton.
Oh, well, fantastic. And for listeners hearing my dog bark outside my room, hopefully that was kind of, either Freudian, so to speak, to have a dog bark and have Chief Olson ask us for a donation to the canine group.
Yeah.
Too funny. Chief Olson, thank you again for taking the time. Congratulations on your career. Congratulations on the work that you've done, and continued success in bringing in the next set of leaders, the next set of officers, whether they be male or female. It's the city of Appleton's very lucky to have you there.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, and thank you for the work that you do, and just for, again, teaching our listeners of what kinds of opportunities exist in public safety, and hopefully maybe we can get a few more recruits out of it as well.
Absolutely. Well, folks, what an interesting discussion. The half the population is female, and therefore, like in most jobs, you would assume that half the population of police officers would be female, and that isn't the case. They are still a small minority, and I think that's and Chief Olson articulating some of the challenges historically, but also articulating the path forward looks much brighter. That with de-escalation tools, with the importance of engaging in a wider scope of topics like mental illness, we need more female officers, and we need more female executives to provide the leadership to, and the space and the mentorship to bring more females into those leadership positions. And I think Chief Olson's is a good example that it's possible, and not only possible, but a very positive experience. Having said that, I was fascinated to listen to and hear the challenges, right? How do you raise a family in that context? How do you manage pregnancies and all the things that come along with that when you're not at a normal desk job? And how do police agencies evolve to try to support females as they move up the ranks? So it's an important topic. It's certainly one that police agencies will need to continue to put focus on, as they do on other topics like mental health and mental wellness. This is another area that hopefully police agencies across the U.S. will continue to get better at. So wrapping up, again, you've been listening and hopefully enjoyed listening to me. My name is Bob Plaschke, and this is First Response. It is a podcast dedicated to understanding the stories behind the people that wear a badge, who the very brave first responders, more than 1 million out there in the United States. And I am very privileged that this is sponsored by Pepperball, the company that I have the honor to be the CEO of. And again, Pepperball, we deploy non-lethal tools that allow police officers to do their jobs, but not have to use their guns and not have to suffer and keep themselves and the public that they serve safe. Until next time, appreciate it and be safe out there.